It is the year 2045. You are watching this report from the Bureau of Failed Utopian Ideologies. Recently, the board of directors asked me to research and produce a report on the rise and fall of communism because it seems that some people in our dystopian future still don't know what a massive clusterfuck it was. So let's go back to the beginning. Back when the French centers were still making wine without adding the HIV to it, there was this guy named Karl Marx who wrote a book called Das Kapital. Now, Das Kapital was like War and Peace, where you actually had to read the whole thing to get the point. It was more like Twitter, where the entire book could be summed up with one single tweet. And that tweet was boohoo, capitalism bad. Most economists agree that capitalism, which at the time was the leading economic system, was pretty crappy. At the very least, it created huge disparities between the rich and the poor. The top 10% of earners were doing great, but everyone else was stuck in absolute poverty. But if you went to your boss and complained about your wages, he would just hire someone else to replace you. The result was that workers were constantly competing against each other, driving down wages and keeping everyone miserable. In response, the working class, or proletariat, began to unite and organize into unions and political parties to demand changes to their working conditions. But it wasn't enough. In order to overthrow capitalism, they needed a new utopian ideology to replace it. Enter Marxism. The main idea was that all the means of production, things like factories, farms, and railroads, should be owned communally, usually by the state. In theory, this would ensure that everyone would get paid fairly for their labor. Also, once the means of production were no longer concentrated in the hands of a few, society itself would change and we'd all live in a post-scarcity egalitarian utopia. Or in other words, a world without private property, social hierarchy, money, poverty, hunger, or anything that might upset our resident Karens. Of course, this transition wouldn't be easy. In the inevitable struggle between the haves and have-nots, the proletariat would need to engage in violent revolution to overthrow the capitalist class, or bourgeoisie. But once that was done, we'd finally reached the communist utopia. And now let's fast forward to the present day and see how well that worked out. The first country to try communism was Russia, which in 1917 overthrew the Tsarist government and replaced it with a communist one, led by Vladimir Lenin. Under his leadership, Russia became the first modern democracy where everyone had the right to vote regardless of gender or race. They also introduced the world's first state-sponsored free healthcare and free education systems. Unfortunately, Lenin died in 1924, at which point power fell into the hands of Joseph Stalin. He would go on to kill millions of people for disagreeing with him, including many of Lenin's close friends and family. The rest of Europe would watch this happen and say, HMM, maybe communism not so good after all. But there was still hope that it could work if only they could avoid Stalin's mistakes. So, in 1945, after World War II, China overthrew their government and established the People's Republic of China under the leadership of Mao Zedong. Like Stalin, Mao would go on to kill millions of his own people, including during the Great Leap Forward, an economic experiment designed to rapidly transform China from an agrarian economy into a modern industrial one. It was probably the biggest failure in the history of human civilization. The result was that tens of millions of Chinese died of starvation. Despite this colossal failure, Mao continued to rule over China until his death in 1976. By this point, most of the world was starting to realize that communism was a terrible idea. But there were still a few holdouts. Cuba, for example, overthrew their dictator in 1959 and replaced him with a communist government led by Fidel Castro. Unlike mainland China, Cuba's economy never really industrialized. But that didn't stop them from blowing most of their GDP on military spending, which is why they became known as the redneck Caribbean pirates. Castro would rule over the island nation until 2008. These days, only a handful of countries consider themselves to be communist. Most of these are small island nations off the coast of the Pacific like North Korea, Laos, and Vietnam. But even they've mixed communism with capitalism to varying degrees. So it's hard to say that they're true communists anymore, despite the fact that it's clearly a terrible idea. Every couple years there is a bunch of college students who decide to revive the corpse of communism and make it their political identity. And that's because the underlying issues that gave rise to communism in the first place, namely inequality and worker exploitation, are still around today. For example, the CEO of Amazon makes nearly 3 times as much as the entire bottom 50% of American society combined. On top of that, Amazon is arguably the worst place to work in America. If you want to quit your job and do something more meaningful with your life, you should start by smashing that like button. We'll pay you in karma points. And now let's look at another utopian ideology that has been tried and failed. That's right, it's socialism. Come for the tour. Socialism is like communism, except instead of abolishing private property, it just puts limits on it. That way, while most of the means of production are owned privately, the government will step in to ensure that no one person can own too much. This usually takes the form of high taxes on the wealthy and strong regulations on corporations. Sounds like a great idea on paper, right? Well, unfortunately, it turns out that people who make lots of money tend to be really good at making lots of money. So if you take a bunch of their money and give it to people who aren't very good at making money, it won't last long before those people have sucked the entire economy dry. This is why every socialist country eventually devolves into communism. Oh, hi Venezuela. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Arthur. If you enjoy quick overviews on important topics, then be sure to subscribe. Anarchy is anarcho-socialism, which is a weird hybrid ideology that combines the concepts of anarchism and socialism. Anarchism is pretty easy to explain. It is basically whatever you get when you throw a bunch of kids into a room with crayons and let them design their own society. In an anarchist society, there would be no government or laws. Instead, everyone would just live together in harmony. Sounds great until someone tries to build a treehouse on your lawn and you have to kill them with your bare hands. Anarcho-socialists are aware of this problem and argue that in a truly equitable society, no one would feel the need to hoard resources, which is why there would be no conflict. Unfortunately, human history tells us otherwise. When left to their own devices, humans fight over territory and resources. Just ask Jared Diamond. That being said, there are some promising developments. For example, we recently learned that ants use their abdomens as storage space for food. So if we can find a way to integrate this technology into human society, we may finally be able to achieve anarcho-socialism. Now, before we wrap things up, I want to take a moment to address the elephant in the room. What about democratic socialism? Is that any better? It's not? Let me prove it. Many countries like Sweden and Denmark implement policies that are considered to be socialist, such as free healthcare and generous welfare programs. But they still maintain a capitalist economy and have no intention of giving up private property. The reason why they're able to do this is because their citizens pay some of the highest taxes in the world, which is why you never hear any of them complaining about income inequality. They're too busy paying off their taxes. But there is one Nordic country that implements a form of democratic socialism known as the Nordic model. That country is Norway. Under the Nordic model, the state owns 35% of the shares in most publicly traded companies. The government justifies this on the grounds that if any one person or group comes to own too much of a company, it could threaten Norway's cherished free market economy. The threat is so great, in fact, that the government even owns a company whose sole purpose is to buy up shares in companies that might threaten Norway's economy. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a pretty socialist idea to me. But if you still don't believe me, just wait until the next time some asshole tries to tell you that Scandinavia isn't real socialism. Then you can hit them in the face with these facts. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then check out my other content where I apply the scientific method to topics of public interest. I've done studies on whether or not God exists, if life on Earth began naturally, and even investigated the possibility of time travel. All my content is driven by your suggestions, so please leave them in the comments below. As always, I'll see you next time.